The sun was cruel that day, hanging low over the Arizona dust. The woman's hands were cuffed in front of her, skin raw where the rope had rubbed. A POW freshly arrived from the Pacific Theater, she stood before a group of American soldiers in Stetsons, their boots caked in red earth, their silence louder than any scream. She braced for mockery, for punishment, for pain. But then one of them stepped forward, lean, quiet, mustache catching the sweat. His boots stopped inches from hers. He tilted his hat back, looked her in the eye, and said just 3 words, "Ma'am, you're safe." She didn't flinch. She didn't move. But something in her face cracked. A hush swept over the men. Even the wind seemed to pause. Those 3 words, simple, soft, impossibly gentle, fell like a bomb through everything she had been taught. In that silence, a war began to unravel, not the one with bullets, but the one inside her. The moment froze, but the story had begun long before that, far from the desert sun of Arizona, deep within the choking heat of a jungle ravine half a world away. It was there, under a green canopy thick with insects and the smell of blood, that the nurse had last believed she would die. Her unit was gone. Left behind with a half-empty canteen, a blood-soaked bandage around her thigh, and the echoes of her commanding officer's voice urging them to run, she had stumbled into a gully, convinced it would be her grave. The silence was unbearable. No more shouts, no more orders, just the sound of her own breathing, too loud, too afraid. When the enemy found her, she was too weak to resist. She had waited for the shot, the blade, the end promised in every lecture, every poster, every sacred oath. Instead, they bound her wrists with cloth, not wire. They gave her water before questions. And as she was lifted onto a stretcher, her last coherent thought before darkness was not of her emperor, but of confusion. She awoke in a holding camp by the coast, skin covered in mosquito bites, tongue thick with thirst. The Americans spoke in clipped commands she didn't understand, but none struck her, none spat. They fed her rice, thin and unfamiliar, but rice nonetheless. A week passed, then another. The rumors whispered by other captives spread like infection. They were being taken to America, not executed, not tortured, transported. She couldn't believe it. America was a demon without a face, a ghost that dropped fire from the sky and shredded cities with metal. America was not a place. It was a curse. The ship came in the night. The women were lined up and loaded aboard like cattle. The nurse clutched the hem of her uniform as if it might anchor her to something real. The hold was dark and hot, filled with bodies too sick to speak. Some moaned in their sleep. Others stared ahead, vacant. The air smelled of iron and urine. She kept expecting someone to lash out, to remind her she was the enemy. But the guards were methodical, detached. She was no longer a threat. She was a number, a ghost in reverse. Days blurred, nights offered no sleep. She vomited once, twice, then stopped eating altogether. The sea was not cruel. It was indifferent. The journey stretched on like punishment without reason. When land finally rose on the horizon, she expected cages, whips, screams. Instead, there was something worse: order. The desert air hit her like a slap. Dry, open, utterly foreign. They called it Arizona, a name she had never heard, as strange to her as mercy. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire, but not chaos. The guards wore boots, not anger. Their eyes were clear. She was marched off the transport with the others, her limbs trembling under the weight of sun and silence. Rows of buildings stood like paper cutouts, neatly spaced on packed earth. There was no shouting, no spitting, only procedures, forms, buckets of water, lines of women. Some whispered. Others cried. She said nothing. Her voice had been left somewhere in the ocean, drowned by disbelief. They gave her a bed, a mattress. She stared at it like it might vanish if she blinked. Then they handed her a tray, bread, stew, something red, steaming. The guard said something she didn't catch, then moved on. Her hands shook as she picked up the spoon. She did not eat. She watched the others instead. Some devoured it, others hid it. She only breathed. That night, she sat on her mattress, back straight, hands folded in her lap. No one came to beat her. No one called her a dog. The only sound was wind sliding against the wire fence. She did not know yet what this place was, but it was not hell, and that terrified her more than anything. The sun rose with sharp edges in the desert, casting long shadows over the rows of barracks and the wire fence that circled everything like a loose grip. The air was dry, open, and too still. To the nurse it felt like standing inside a painting, one that moved slowly, if at all. This was a prison camp, but it did not smell of blood or fear. It smelled of dust, of distant coffee, of horses somewhere beyond the fence. The contrast was so stark it left her unmoored. In the Pacific, war had meant mud and screams and rot. Here, men in pressed uniforms leaned against wooden railings, sipping from tin mugs as if they were on a porch instead of guarding the enemy. Barbed wire cut the horizon, yet birds still landed on it, unfazed. The camp ran like a ranch more than a battlefield. Every morning a bell rang, not sharp like a siren, but dull and steady, as if announcing chores. The prisoners moved in lines, but not under barking orders. The guards did not shout. They spoke in slow, accented English, their words stretched long like shadows at dusk. Some of them wore wide-brimmed hats, dusty boots, and leather belts that clinked with the weight of nothing but keys. She had never seen men like them before, men who looked more like cattlemen than soldiers. One chewed something constantly, another tipped his hat when he passed the women. It felt absurd. She had imagined American soldiers as wolves, laughing as they set fire to villages. These men looked like they had ridden in from a country song. Among them was one who rarely spoke. He was tall, with a mustache that framed a face carved by sun and silence. His boots were scuffed, his steps deliberate. He carried his rifle slung low like an afterthought. The first time she saw him, he was handing a dog-eared book to another prisoner, nodding once before walking off. He did not stare, he did not smirk, but he looked, and when he did, it was like he saw through every defense she had learned to wear. She kept her distance. She told herself he was playing a game, lulling them into calm before the real cruelty began. She had seen it before, kindness as bait, but each day passed and nothing came. She ate in silence, back straight. She slept with one eye open, her fingers curled around the edge of the mattress like it might be taken. When other women began whispering at night, she kept her eyes on the ceiling, refusing to speak. She would not trust them. Not the guards, not the softness of bread, not the absence of screams. The camp felt like a lie carefully built. She waited for it to crack, but the crack never came. There were routines, roll call, meals, optional work assignments. The guards patrolled like clock hands, predictable, unemotional. They weren't warm, but they weren't cruel. If you tripped, they helped you up. If you disobeyed, they spoke, not struck. When she dropped her canteen once, one of the cowboys, not the quiet one but another, picked it up, handed it back, and said, "No problem, miss." She didn't understand the words, but the tone was soft. The familiarity was disarming. It made her stomach twist. She had prepared for pain, not politeness. Still, she remained tense. Each act of civility felt like the tightening of a noose made of velvet. She couldn't shake the fear that this was prelude, that the mask would fall and the demons would show themselves. Her body stayed braced, her eyes sharp, her movements cautious. She ate slowly, like a prisoner expecting the food to vanish. She watched the cowboy, the quiet one, as he did his rounds, as he leaned on fences, as he offered nothing but space and time. He never tried to speak to her. He never even got too close. But he saw her, and that, somehow, was worse. Each morning the sun returned, cruel in its brightness, exposing everything, the wire, the dust, the strange rhythm of a camp that wasn't a camp. The women walked in lines. The cowboys stood like statues. The war, it seemed, had paused in this pocket of desert, replaced not by cruelty, but by something far more dangerous, the possibility of peace. And for her, that was a war she did not know how to fight. Inside her, the teachings of Bushido still screamed, even in silence. Even now, surrounded by men who offered no threats and made no demands, the voices of her instructors echoed like drums. Surrender is shame. Mercy is a lie. Death is duty. She had whispered the creed with her own lips back in the training compound near Osaka, her knees pressed to the floor, sweat trailing down her back, eyes fixed forward. She remembered how the instructor had said the words slowly, as if etching them into their spines. Better to die with honor than live in disgrace. And so she had believed that capture would mean horror, that her name would be stricken from her family record, that she would never return home except as a spirit. But now, here she sat, alive, unhurt, and completely unready for it. She avoided the stew in the mornings, even when the scent made her stomach cry out. She refused the white bread, soft and strange, and took only water when she could not ignore her thirst. At night, she lay with her eyes open, listening to the shifting of blankets, the occasional cough, the far-off murmur of guards speaking in English outside the barracks. Around her, the other women began to change. Slowly, quietly. At first they only whispered to one another when the lights were low, barely audible exchanges in the dark. Then came the laughter, hesitant, nervous, but real. It was laughter that did not belong in a prison. One woman accepted lipstick from the canteen and applied it with shaking hands. Another was seen helping a guard carry crates of supplies. One even began to hum a tune she had picked up from a passing harmonica. These were not acts of rebellion, but they were acts of change. And to the nurse, they felt like betrayal. She watched them from the edges, her spine never relaxing, her fingers always tense. They were breaking under the weight of kindness, and she hated them for it. She envied them too. She could not understand the quiet cowboy who watched without intruding. He never tried to speak to her, never forced her hand. But she felt his gaze sometimes, not heavy like a threat, but steady, like a rope stretched across a chasm. She expected a crack in his mask, a sneer, a snide word, a slip of cruelty to confirm everything she'd been taught. But it never came. Once he left a canteen by her bunk after she had coughed all through the night. Another time she found a small bar of soap tucked into her folded uniform. There was no note, no explanation, just small things placed carefully with no demand for thanks. And then the blanket. It appeared at the foot of her bed one cold night, folded neatly. Not military issue. Thicker. Wool, maybe. She stared at it for hours, unmoving. She didn't know if it came from him, but she knew. Her hands hovered over it like it might bite. Finally, she pulled it to her chest and held it there, fists tight in the fabric. She didn't sleep. She didn't pray. But as the others drifted off around her, She pressed her face into the soft folds and began to cry, quietly, bitterly, not from pain, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of being seen. In her world, tears had no place, compassion had no function, comfort was weakness. But this small silent offering, shattered something. The tears came in silence, just like the code that had once ruled her. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of obedience, it was the silence of a truth she could no longer avoid. The enemy had not struck her. The enemy had not spat on her. The enemy had given her a blanket, and that, somehow, was worse. It was the next morning that the coffee appeared. Steam curled from the tin mug like incense in a shrine, rich and unfamiliar. She stared at it suspiciously, the surface trembling as it reflected the morning sun through the barracks window. A guard, not the cowboy, but one of the younger ones with a boy's face and soldier's boots, placed it in front of her without a word. She looked down at the strange black liquid, unsure if it was safe, unsure if it was a test. The others had already begun sipping theirs, quiet murmurs of surprise or distaste spreading through the mess hall like smoke. She took a breath and raised the mug to her lips. The bitterness hit her tongue like iron. Her face twisted, and she coughed hard, the sound breaking the stillness of the room. Across the table, the cowboy, sitting just a few feet away for the first time, let out a short, low chuckle. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't cruel. It was soft, almost amused, like the laugh of someone watching a child try something for the first time. Her eyes snapped to his, wide with the instinct to recoil. But his face held no glee, just calm. He looked down at his own cup and took a sip. She didn't move, but she didn't flinch either. That moment stayed with her longer than she expected. The coffee had tasted like ash, but it was the sound, that single small laugh, that lingered like an echo. She had been raised to believe Americans were incapable of gentleness, that they were mechanical, vulgar, loud. But this man laughed like her uncle used to, back when rice was still plentiful and the days still felt safe. It was wrong, it was dangerous, and it made her stomach twist. The next day she returned to the same table, not by choice, but by routine. The coffee was there again, waiting. This time she reached for it without hesitation, and without knowing why. The same sharp bitterness met her tongue. She winced, but did not cough. Remembering how the others had taken sugar the morning before, she searched the table for the small tin marked with English letters she couldn't read. She scooped a spoonful and stirred it into her mug. The taste didn't change. If anything, it got worse. Confused, she tried again, adding another spoonful. Her face crumpled in protest after the next sip. It was like seawater. Around her, someone stifled a laugh. She looked up and saw him, the cowboy, watching her from the next table. Slowly he stood, stepped forward, and without a word picked up her mug. He brought it to his own lips and took a sip. He made a face, exaggerated and theatrical, then raised an eyebrow. "Salt," he said, tapping the tin gently with his knuckle. He pointed to another, smaller container. "Sugar." Then, without scolding or smirking, he set the mug down and gave her a nod, a shrug, as if to say, "Could have happened to anyone." She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. It was a tiny thing, meaningless, maybe. A bad cup of coffee and a misplaced spoon. But it chipped something. It shifted the balance of silence between them. She had expected him to correct her with authority. Instead, he tasted the salt himself, shared in the mistake. In that simple act, something unspoken passed between them. Later, alone in her bunk, she turned the moment over in her mind like a pebble in her hand. She could still taste the salt, But she also remembered his voice, soft and foreign, not barked in command, but spoken like a phrase meant only for her. She remembered his eyes, not hard but steady. It terrified her, because for the first time she had not seen a soldier. She had seen a man, and that flicker, that breath of something close to trust, was more dangerous than any bullet. The next shift came not with a sound, but with the scratch of graphite against paper. It began on a morning like the others, dry, sunlit, still, when the guards came through the barracks carrying small wooden boxes. One by one, they laid them out on the center table, lined sheets, envelopes, stubby yellow pencils worn down to near nothing. At first, no one moved. The women watched, frozen by the sheer strangeness of it. Writing, letters, words, for them? It was almost comical, as if they'd been offered instruments of war and told to play lullabies. In the jungle, paper was used to pack wounds, to light fires. Words were for orders, not expression. For her, especially, the idea of putting thoughts into writing felt like a kind of heresy. She hadn't written since her capture. She hadn't even spoken her full name, not aloud, not to anyone. Later that morning, as she stood quietly beside the mess hall waiting for the midday roll call, she saw him again. The cowboy. Cal. That was the name stitched in faded black thread across the patch above his chest pocket. She had read it before, unsure of its meaning. A place? A code? A sound without weight? This time he approached slowly, carrying nothing but a single pencil and a folded page torn from one of the writing kits. He held them out, not intrusively, just an offering. She didn't reach for them. Not right away. He waited. Then, with a single finger, he tapped his name tag. Cal. His voice didn't come. He didn't need it. He pointed once, then gently touched the pencil again. For her. A trade without a price. Then he left, boots crunching lightly on the sand. She sat alone that evening on the edge of her cot, the pencil and paper still untouched beside her. The women around her whispered about letters to home, about the families who might never read them, about the absurd idea of trying, but she didn't write a letter. She didn't even try to form a sentence. Instead, she stared at the paper as if it were sacred. She hadn't written her own name since the day her unit abandoned her. Back home, names were layered with duty. A family name first, the bloodline, then the given name, to be spoken rarely, held close. During training, they were referred to by rank or number. Identity was a luxury. She had traded hers for survival. Now, with the pencil in her hand, fingers trembling slightly, she lowered it to the page. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She simply wrote it, her name. Not the one shouted across drills or etched into documents, the real one. Her mother's voice when she was small, her father's whisper after bad dreams. She stared at it for a long time. Her handwriting had changed. Slower now, less certain. But the letters were hers. Shapes she had once practiced in school with ink-stained fingers. Shapes that belonged to her and her alone. She folded the paper once, carefully, then again, smaller still, until it could fit inside the inner lining of her uniform pocket. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't show it. But she kept it there, pressed close to her skin like a relic. Not of war, but of something lost and now found. That night, as she lay on her mattress listening to the desert winds whisper through the wire, she didn't cry, she didn't tremble, she simply breathed, steady, full. Her name was not a weapon, not a warning, not a label for a prisoner. It was her. And for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, that was enough. Cal had not asked for her name, but somehow he had given it back to her. The change didn't arrive like thunder. It came on the wind, soft and strange, just after sunset. The desert sky was cooling, stained with fading golds and purples, and the camp had fallen into its evening rhythm. Trays collected, boots shuffled, the slow hum of another day ending. She sat near her bunk, legs folded beneath her, eyes half-lidded but always alert. That's when she heard it. A sound so foreign, so gentle, it startled her more than gunfire ever had. It was music, a harmonica. The notes drifted on the air like a secret, soft and reedy, pulling itself through the wire fences and into the hollow spaces between breaths. She turned toward the sound instinctively. It came from near the fence, where the guards often took their breaks. And though she couldn't see clearly, she didn't have to. She knew it was him. The tune was slow, plaintive, not joyful, but not sad either. It had the feeling of something worn with time. It didn't march, it didn't command, it simply moved, like a river long forgotten. She didn't understand the melody. There were no lyrics, but it stirred something. Images began to rise in her mind, uninvited. The rice paddies outside Kyoto, stretching like silk under a spring sky. Her sister, laughing with wet feet and wind in her hair. Her father's calloused hands playing with a bamboo flute in the garden decades ago. She closed her eyes. The harmonica did not ask for permission. It didn't interrogate. It didn't demand a side. It just was. And for the first time since the jungle, since the moment she was left behind and her world shattered, she allowed herself to feel the weight of memory without resisting it. The camp was still a prison. The barbed wire hadn't vanished. The guards still carried rifles. But in that moment, the music made it feel like the walls were thinner. Not physically, but emotionally. It cracked something open, something she had buried too deep for words. When she opened her eyes again, the stars were brighter than they had any right to be. The music had stopped. Silence returned, but it was softer now. Less like a cage, more like a pause. The women around her murmured quietly, some smiling to themselves, others lost in thought. No one laughed, no one mocked. Later, as she lay in her cot, blanket pulled high and the paper with her name still tucked in her sleeve, she found herself listening for the sound again, hoping it would return. But it didn't, and somehow that made it more real. She dreamed that night, not of soldiers or death or the long ocean voyage. She dreamed of her sister's hair blowing in a summer breeze, of fish markets and morning bells, of laughter. It startled her when she woke up, how her eyes were wet but her chest was light. Music, she realized, was not a weapon. It was not propaganda. It was memory-made sound, a language that neither side needed to translate. And though she had spent her whole life believing that the enemy had no soul, no softness, this single melody, carried on a cowboy's breath through a battered old harmonica, had undone more of her hatred than months of bread and blankets ever could. That tune had said more than words, and it had asked nothing in return. She never told him what it meant, but the next day, when she passed him by the mess tent, she didn't look down. She didn't avert her gaze. For the first time she met his eyes, not as a prisoner, not as a nurse, not even as a woman, but simply as a human being who had remembered how to feel. It happened the next afternoon, under a sky bleached white by heat. The Arizona sun bore down on the camp like judgment, swallowing shadows and leaving everything exposed. The women had been gathering near the supply shed, sorting clothing and washing linens, part of the daily routine that blurred the days into something resembling peace. That was when one of the newer prisoners, a girl barely out of childhood, her cheeks hollow from fever, staggered mid-step and dropped to her knees. There was no cry, no drama, just the soft thump of her body meeting the dust. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then instinct took over. The nurse, the woman who had once marched through jungle paths with wounds pressed under her palms, who had sown flesh by moonlight and whispered prayers she never believed, rushed forward. Her hands moved without thought, checking pulse, clearing airways, shielding the girl's face from the direct sun. The others backed away, their breaths caught in their throats. That was when the boots came. The cowboy, Cal. He moved toward them quickly, though not with alarm, more like gravity pulling him to the center of a storm. His eyes swept over the scene, registering the girl, the nurse, the trembling women around them. His rifle stayed slung over his back, untouched. No orders, no shouting, just presence. She looked up at him, sweat streaking down her temple, the girl's limp body cradled in her arms. For a moment, their eyes locked, not with challenge, not with fear, but with something deeper, understanding. And then he said it. "Ma'am, you're safe." 3 words. She didn't recognize the phrase. Not fully. The sounds were English, foreign and strange, but the tone, low, steady, almost reverent, cut through her like lightning. The other guards, gathered nearby, froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the wind seemed to pause. It was as if the entire camp had turned to stone. The words didn't ring like commands. They landed like truth. Safe. A concept she had never been taught, never allowed to imagine. Even as a child in wartime Japan, there had been drills, alerts, expectations of sacrifice. As a nurse in the Imperial Army, she had been told again and again, "You are not to be rescued. You are not to be comforted. If taken, you are already dead." But now, kneeling in the dirt with another woman's weight in her arms and the taste of copper in her throat, she heard that word spoken not like a sentence, but like an offering, a permission. She didn't speak, couldn't. Her body remained still, but inside everything shifted. The fortress she had built, of silence, of loyalty, of fear, cracked, not shattered, just enough to let the wind through. She looked around. The guards' faces were unreadable. The women prisoners stared with wide eyes, unsure of what they had just witnessed. There were no cheers, no tears, just silence, and yet it felt louder than any explosion. Cal knelt beside her, carefully lifting the girl from her arms. No spectacle, no heroism, just quiet strength. As he carried her toward the infirmary, the nurse remained kneeling, her hands empty now, but trembling slightly, not from exhaustion, but from something unfamiliar. Safety, not a location, not a fortress, a moment, a man's voice in the heat, a stillness after collapse. Later, in the barracks, she would turn the phrase over in her mind, trying to catch its meaning like fireflies in a jar. But deep down, she had already understood. He hadn't meant just the camp. He hadn't meant just the girl. He had meant her. She was safe, and somehow, impossibly, she believed him. That belief did not settle gently. It came like a tremor beneath her ribs, subtle at first, then growing, unsettling the foundations she had lived upon for as long as she could remember. The next morning she woke before the bell, sitting upright on her bunk with her hand pressed over her chest, as if to steady something restless beneath her sternum. The desert was still dark outside, the sky only beginning to pale at the edges, but she could not lie down again. She felt too full, too shaken, too alive. When the guards placed the writing boxes on the center table later that afternoon, pencils, paper, envelopes, she already knew what she was going to do. She waited until the others had taken their supplies, until the noise faded and the women dispersed. Only then did she step forward, choosing a single sheet and a pencil worn down almost to its wooden stub. She carried them back to her bunk like contraband, heart beating fast, palms damp. For a moment she just stared at the paper, the blankness both comforting and terrifying. She knew letters home were allowed. She had seen others write them, had watched the guards collect the envelopes with the same neutral expression they used for everything. Whether the letters ever reached Japan, none of the women knew. But still, they wrote. Still, they tried. She had not. Until now. Her hand hovered above the page, then settled, then began. At first the words came stiffly, formal phrases drilled into her as a child, the proper beginnings of correspondence. But very quickly something shifted. Her writing curved, softened. She was not reporting, not explaining. She was telling the truth. She wrote about the heat, the landscape, the strangeness of waking each day in a place that did not look like war. She wrote about hunger easing, about sleep returning in fragments. But eventually, inevitably, her pencil paused. And then, with a breath she did not realize she was holding, she wrote the words she could not stop thinking about. He called me safe. The moment the sentence formed on the page, she froze. Her breath caught, her fingers trembled. It felt like treason. It felt like confession. It felt like standing on a cliff's edge and stepping forward anyway. She stared at the words until her eyes blurred. She had betrayed nothing by writing them, and yet she had betrayed everything. Bushido, the code, the doctrine that survival in enemy hands was shame worse than death. She had been taught that the enemy would break her, defile her, erase her humanity. Instead, he had restored a piece of it with 3 simple words. Her pencil moved again, slower now, each stroke heavy with meaning. I was not harmed. I was seen. When she finished, the letter was short, barely a page, but it carried more truth than anything she had ever dared to speak aloud. She folded it carefully, slid it into an envelope, and held it for a long, trembling moment before placing it in the collection box. She did not know it would never leave the camp, did not know it would be intercepted, opened, filed away by hands that never learned her name. She would never learn that her quiet truth never crossed the ocean. But none of that mattered when she wrote it. In that moment, the act itself was liberation. She had spoken into the dark, even if no one would hear her. And in doing so, she had reclaimed the part of herself she thought captivity had stolen forever. If you're feeling this story so far, don't forget to like this video and drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. We're reading every single one. The day she left the camp, the sky was clear, almost too clear. There were no storms to match the weight in her chest, no thunder to echo the conflict churning inside her as she stepped beyond the gates. They had opened not with a clang, but with a low groan. An ending, yes, but not a clean one. She stood for a moment just outside the wire, blinking in the wide Arizona sun, her satchel slung over one shoulder. Inside it, she carried only 2 things: the thin wool blanket he had left for her months ago, and the folded piece of paper with her name written in her own hand. The truck ride to the coast was silent. Even the guards riding up front said little. She didn't speak. None of the women did. Their eyes were turned inward, fixed on ghosts only they could see. The convoy moved slow across the desert, the wheels chewing up dust that painted the sky behind them. And when they reached the port, the ship waiting there was no grand vessel, just a transport, gray, rusted, tired from war. Like them. She didn't cry, not when the ramp lifted, not when the coastline disappeared, but her hand tightened around the blanket, pressing it into her lap like armor. The voyage home was long, stretching over days that blurred like ink on damp paper. At night, the waves slapped against the hull like whispers. She would lie awake, listening, wondering what waited for her across the sea. Japan had changed. She knew that. The news passed in fragments through the barracks before, cities flattened, food scarce, families scattered. But she didn't fear the rubble. She feared the silence, the questions, the judgment in familiar eyes. It came on the fourth day of the journey. She was sitting near the railing, watching the horizon bleed into the clouds, when another woman, one she barely knew, slid onto the bench beside her. They exchanged no greeting, just the hush of shared displacement. Then the woman asked, "What were they like? The Americans?" The question floated there, soft but heavy. She could have lied, could have recited the things they were told to believe, that they were cruel, that they were monsters, that survival meant suffering. Instead, she said nothing. She closed her eyes, and quietly, almost without thinking, she began to hum. The tune was broken, incomplete, the old cowboy's harmonica melody, carried in memory like breath. The woman beside her tilted her head, listening, then nodded once. No more words were exchanged, because how could she explain it? How could she describe the warmth of black coffee in a tin cup handed without threat? Or the strange reverence in the phrase, "Ma'am, you're safe"? How could she name the war inside her, between what she had been taught and what she had lived? She didn't have the words, not yet. But she carried the truth anyway. She would return to Japan, changed in ways that made no sense to anyone. Her posture would be softer, her silences heavier. She would keep the blanket, folded at the foot of her bed for years, never explaining where it came from. And tucked in a box, wrapped in cloth, the paper with her name, the one written by her own will, would remain untouched, but never forgotten. There was no homecoming celebration, no parade, just a quiet stepping back into a country that no longer quite fit. But in the quiet, she found something new. Peace without a name. Not victory, not surrender. Just a moment of stillness, earned not by bullets or flags, but by kindness. The years passed like waves, quiet, relentless. She built a life in post-war Japan with the same quiet determination she had used to survive. She married, had a daughter, found work in a clinic where the light was always dim and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled rice. Life was not easy, but it was hers. And in the quiet hours, after the dishes were washed and the child asleep, she would sometimes unfold the paper with her name and hold it like prayer. She never spoke of the camp, not at first. When people asked where she had been during the war, she would answer with a simple word, South. No more. It was easier that way. Some wounds live beneath the skin, too deep for language. But time does strange things. It rounds off the edges of memory, and sometimes it makes room for stories to breathe. It was a spring night, decades later, in a small apartment filled with the faint scent of plum blossoms from the open window. Her daughter, now in high school, sat cross-legged on the tatami mat, flipping through an old picture book. She asked a simple question, something about America, about the war, about the stories other children were hearing from their grandparents. And that night, the mother told her a story. Not about battles, not about jungles, not about loss, but about a cowboy. She said he wore a hat too big for his head and boots that thudded when he walked. He didn't shout, he didn't strike, he carried a harmonica in his pocket and could make it sing like the wind. He gave her a pencil, a blanket, a name. And one day he said 3 words that changed everything. The daughter laughed, not unkindly, but the way children do when they think they've caught their mother in a fairy tale. "A cowboy?" she grinned. "In Arizona?" The mother only smiled. a slow, soft smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Yes," she said, "a cowboy." There was so much she didn't say, about the weight of silence, about the letter that never reached home, about the way those 3 words had rattled something ancient inside her and left behind a space where something new could grow. She didn't explain that kindness could be more disarming than cruelty, that it could burrow beneath armor and plant seeds that bloomed years later. She didn't tell her daughter that kindness, not pity, not performance, but real, unasked kindness, rewires the mind, that it rearranges memory, carving out space where once there was only dread. She just told the story, and that was enough. Later, after her daughter had gone to bed, the mother stood by the window, looking out at the street lamps casting halos on the pavement. She reached into the drawer where she kept old things, a blanket now frayed thin, and the folded name paper yellowed at the edges. She held it for a moment, then, carefully, put it back. She wasn't broken. She had seen horror, yes, but she had also seen a man sip salted coffee and call her ma'am. She had been seen, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as a person, and no one could take that from her. If this story moved you, give the video a like and leave a comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and why stories like this matter to you. We're listening, always.